Hello, students. Dr. Lyons here, and what we're going to be talking about in this chapter is processes that go on inside of the cell. So you already know all about the different organelles that we can find inside of eukaryotic cells. And what we're going to talk about here is some important things that happen. So for instance, we're going to talk a little bit about how energy is converted within cells. We'll talk a little bit about how products move in and out of cells. And we'll talk a little bit more about how chemical reactions take place inside of cells. We're going to talk in a little bit more detail about enzymes, which we talked about kind of briefly in chapter 3 and then in chapter 4. So I'll start this lecture by posing the following question, right? How is your body similar to a gas-powered car? There's actually some really striking similarities between the two, right? So keep that question in the back of your mind. Okay, so to kind of lead up to answering that question, we have to talk a little bit more about energy. And so we're going to get into a little bit of physics here. So first of all, let's talk about what energy exactly is. So energy is the capacity to cause changes to things, right? So changing how something looks or changing where something's location is. If you say pick up a heavy weight and move it somewhere else, you have used energy to make that happen because you have caused change to that item, right? The location of that item has changed. So energy is causing changes to things. So moving a chair takes energy. Heating up substances takes energy because you are changing the temperature of something by heating it up. So that requires energy. Or smashing guitars. That, of course, requires a change. That, of course, involves a change. Or in this case, I guess he's actually smashing a bass. But either way, that requires energy because a change is being enacted upon some object. In this case, the guitar. So there's a few different types of energy that we should discuss. So there's kinetic energy, and that is the energy of movement, right? So any moving thing has some energy stored in it. And so the movement itself is what can allow that object to cause a change in something, right? So for instance, if a car was speeding down the street, and if I don't know, say some poor unsuspecting squirrel or whatever happened to step out in front of the car, obviously that car, as a result of its energy, of its kinetic energy, the movement of that car, could cause a change to that poor unsuspecting squirrel. So the movement of an object can allow it to cause a change to something. Heat is a type of kinetic energy because heat has to do with the motion of atoms and molecules. So I mentioned way back in chapter 2 that any object, the molecules and atoms that make up that object are vibrating around. They're in motion. They're moving around. And when an object is really, really hot, the atoms and molecules that make up that object are moving around faster. When that object is really cold, the atoms and molecules are moving around more slowly. So when we heat up something, we're giving it kinetic energy because the atoms and molecules are moving faster and faster and faster. So one really important part of heat energy is the fact that all energy conversions generate some heat, right? So when we change from one form of energy to another form of energy, heat is produced. And I'll give you some examples of that. So potential energy is a type of stored energy. And that could be stored due either to its location or due to its structure. So let's say you have a bookshelf, and let's say you have a bowling ball on that bookshelf, right? That bowling ball has some potential energy due to its location, because if it rolls off of that bookshelf, it's going to smash the floor, maybe put a dent in the floor or break something. It's going to cause a change to something. because it has this potential energy that then can be converted into kinetic energy as it starts to move and falls towards the Earth. So the location of something can give it potential energy. The structure of something can give it potential energy. So this kind of relates to chemical energy. So chemical energy is a type of potential energy, and it's due to the arrangement, due to the structure of atoms and molecules that make up something. So for instance, the food that we eat, there is chemical energy stored inside of that food. Because as you break apart the molecules that make up that food, say there's sugar inside of a food, say there's glucose inside of it. If you break up that glucose, energy is released. And that energy comes from how those carbon molecules in that glucose are attached to each other. When you break them apart, energy is released. It's the same with gasoline or with any other type of fuel. When you break apart the atoms that make up gasoline molecules, energy is released. So kind of an important point of all of this is that energy is conserved, meaning that we convert energy from one variety to another, but we don't ever create more of it or destroy it. So a good example is kind of shown here. Let's say you have a soda bottle of Coca-Cola. If you pick that Coca-Cola up and you start shaking it, you are creating, or not creating, I should say, but there is kinetic energy going on because there's the energy of movement, that bottle is moving back and forth, and so that's kinetic energy. Then you sit that bottle down, and now it has potential energy because of the structure of what's going on in there. You know, it's all shaken up, and all that carbon dioxide wants to escape from the bottle. Then the bottle top pops off, and we have all this moving liquid, flying upwards. So that then is kinetic energy because that's the energy of movement, right? So we're changing between, in this case, kinetic energy, potential energy, and more kinetic energy. So energy gets exchanged back and forth and back and forth. Okay, and so what goes on inside of us is cellular respiration in terms of how energy is moved around, right? So we eat food. Uh, that food has molecules of sugars and proteins and lipids. We break apart those sugars and proteins and lipids. Energy is released from them, and we take that energy and we put it into something known as ATP. So ATP is this molecule that our bodies use. And why we create ATP is because our bodies, as I mentioned in the last chapter, can't directly use the energy that is stored inside of sugars and proteins and lipids. Our bodies need to use ATP. The way that I kind of think about this, and I think this is a pretty good analogy that might work for you, is currencies, right? So all the different countries of the world, have different currencies. So if you were to take, US dollars and you were to drive north of the border up into Canada, you couldn't just use your US dollars up there because up in Canada, they use Canadian dollars and they use what they call loonies and toonies, which are their coins that have that are worth two Canadian dollars. That's a toonie. And there are coins that have a loon, which is a type of bird on them, which is why they call them loonies. Anyway, you couldn't use your US dollars up there. You would have to convert your US dollars into Canadian dollars in order to actually use them. And so it's the same as in us. Our bodies can't use sugars, they can't use proteins, they can't use lipids. What our bodies and what our cells need is ATP. That is the currency that they recognize and that they can actually use. So our bodies have to create ATP by using energy that is stored inside of food molecules. And so when we eat food, roughly 34% of the energy that is in that food is converted to ATP. So that number probably strikes you as pretty low. For instance, you wouldn't be so happy if you only got 34% on the first exam of this semester. And you shouldn't be. That's not very good. And so the reason why we only get 34% of our food energy converted into ATP energy relates to something that I mentioned a little while ago. When we go between different types of energy, we produce some heat. So there's a lot of heat that is lost when we convert food energy into ATP. And so that is a lot of why we are so warm inside, is because when we take our food and break it down and take the energy and convert it into energy in ATP, we produce a tremendous amount of heat, which is why we're so hot inside. So where does the rest of that energy go? A lot of it goes to heat, right? So the rest of the 60 something percent goes to heat. Okay, so let's return back to that original question. How is our bodies similar to a car? So in the case of our bodies, I talked about how we take energy from, we take a molecule of food, in this case glucose, and through cellular respiration, we produce ATP from it. So we convert one type of energy into another type of energy. So chemical energy in glucose into chemical energy that is inside of ATP. And then ATP is then used for the cell doing all the things that it needs to do. As I mentioned, some heat energy is lost in that, right? That's why we're all warm inside. And for our bodies to do cellular respiration, we need oxygen, right? So why all of us are breathing oxygen right now is because it's necessary for cellular respiration to take place. And what we produce as a byproduct is carbon dioxide and water, right? So that's why we're all exhaling carbon dioxide right now. So if we think of a car, it's pretty much identical to what we just described, right? We take octane, we break it apart, and we extract energy from it. But instead of that energy being used to make ATP like our cells do, that energy is used to produce kinetic, or not produce, but is converted into kinetic energy, because the whole point of a car is that it moves around. So we take energy that is stored inside of this compound, inside of octane, and we convert it into kinetic energy, the energy of movement. And just like us, cars need oxygen, right? That's why your car has an air filter and has a carburetor, right? So a carburetor is where the oxygen is mixed with the octane. Or actually, I guess now most cars have what are known as fuel injectors, so they don't actually have a carburetor where oxygen and gas is mixed with each other. But either way, there's a place, either a fuel injector or a carburetor in your cars, where these things are mixed. And carbon dioxide is produced as a byproduct, as is water, which is why when you look at the exhaust coming out of a car, it often has kind of a hazy appearance to it. It's because there's some water vapor that is in there. And like us, so when we convert chemical energy in our food into chemical energy in ATP, we produce heat. Or heat is lost as a sort of byproduct, which is why we're all warm inside. It's the same with a car. I think, as most of you know, if you were to drive a car for a while, you wouldn't want to, lift up the hood and put your hand on the engine, because the engine is going to be really hot. Because when we convert this chemical energy in the form of octane into kinetic energy, when we convert chemical energy in the form of octane into kinetic energy by moving the car, we lose a tremendous amount of heat, which is why the engine of a car is so hot when it's working. So really, our cells are really not that different from a car in a lot of ways. All right, so let's talk a little bit about food calories. Uh, we all know this term, right? So we think of calories as, what is inside of our food. I think a lot of us in general, we think of calories as being bad. However, that's, really not true. We need calories in order to function. But what a calorie actually is in physical terms is the energy that can raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So it's really kind of funny when you think about it, because a calorie refers to this incredibly specific, nuanced thing, right? So raising 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. But we think of calories in a much more broad way as just what is in our food that is the energy that's in our food. So, but one additional wrinkle I want to add to that is that when you look at a nutrition label, the food calories that are on it are actually kilocalories. So kilo means 1,000, like a kilogram is 1,000 grams. So they're actually 1,000 calories. So for instance, this food has 250 calories per serving. So what that actually means is there's 250,000 calories inside of one serving of whatever this food is. So essentially one serving of this food could raise 250,000 grams of water by 1 degree Celsius. So it could increase the temperature of that many grams of water up by 1 degree C, right? That's what this number literally means. Uh, so that's what you're seeing when you look at a food label. Of course, not all food labels have calories. If you go into other countries, they tend to use joules, which is another type of is another unit of energy. So they use joules and they use kilojoules. Of course, all know that different types of food have different amounts of calories in them, and we know that just different activities burn different amounts of calories in them. So, for instance, if you go eat an In-N-Out burger, you're consuming maybe somewhere around 300 food calories, although I'm guessing it's probably actually much higher than that. Um, what you're doing right now, sitting and writing and taking notes, if you do that for 1 hour, you'll burn roughly 28 calories. So after you sit through this lecture, you can award yourself by go eating 1 cup of broccoli, because that cup of broccoli has about 25 calories in it, and you're burning about roughly the same amount of calories by going through this video lecture. So enjoy your 1 cup of broccoli when you're done. Or if you prefer, you can maybe do 2 video lectures, and then you've earned a 1 plain cup of popcorn. Sorry, no butter on that cup of popcorn. Okay, so we've been thrown around this term ATP a couple times now. So now I want to get into it in a little more detail. So ATP, what it literally stands for is adenosine triphosphate. So what ATP consists of is one adenosine in 3 phosphates. So the prefix tri means 3, like a triceratops is a dinosaur with 3 horns. A tricycle is a transport vehicle that has 3 wheels on it. So triphosphate means 3 phosphates. So we have three molecules here that are each made of phosphorus and oxygen. And so how ATP works is there's energy stored in the bonds between these phosphates. So if we take this phosphate and we pluck it off of here, energy is released. And then what we would have created is adenosine diphosphate, because now there's just 2 phosphates attached to it rather than 3 phosphates attached to it. And then we can take this adenosine diphosphate, put some energy back into it, and reattach that phosphate. So when we take ATP, we break it down into ADP, and that releases energy. We take ADP and turn it back into ATP by putting energy back in. So this reaction, what you see going on here, is occurring millions upon millions of times over inside of each and every one of us right now. Right? So all of us right now, we are taking ATP, breaking it down into ADP in order to release energy that's used for moving around and walking and talking and taking notes and all the things that we're all doing. So for instance, one of the things that we're all doing right now is there are muscles inside of us that are working, right? So this is a very simple diagram of what a muscle kind of looks like, right? So here is a protein, or this is a fiber of muscle. You know how muscles essentially work is there are fibers that run past each other. And what happens is there are these things called motor proteins, which are like kind of like little paddles. And what they do is when they get a little energy, they bend. And by bending, they move this fiber to the left, and this fiber goes to the right. And that's essentially how that's essentially how muscles contract, is by all of these little proteins bending and pulling the fibers towards each other. So these little motor proteins, ATP bonds to them. That ATP then converts into ADP, and that causes the protein to bend, which moves the fiber. And the action of millions and millions of these individual motor proteins is what is allowing your heart to beat right now, because your heart is made mostly of muscle. And what's going on there is that muscle is contracting, roughly once a second, and in doing so, it is compressing chambers within your heart that by doing so pushes blood throughout your body. So right now, this is going on inside of you, as we speak, inside of your heart and inside of any other muscles that you're using right now. And so there's a recycling process that goes on here. So as I mentioned before, ATP is broken down into ADP plus one single phosphate. We can then put energy back into these things, into ADP and phosphate, and reattach them to make ATP. Then we can break down that ATP and make ADP and phosphate and release energy. So we have this kind of recycling going on back and forth, which is really important because we use a tremendous amount of ATP. So for instance, inside of one working muscle cell, every time that muscle cell is actually working and constricting, 10 million ATPs are being used per second. So think of your heart. There are thousands and thousands of muscle cells inside of your heart. And each one of those thousands and thousands of muscle cells are each second using 10 million ATPs. So you can kind of see the scale of just how much ATP we use. We're using really billions, if not trillions of ATP molecules, every second for all the things that our bodies need to do. And so it's really important then that we recycle ATP because we need a whole lot of it. Okay, now we're going to talk about another important thing that is going on inside of us. We're going to talk about chemical reactions and about enzymes. But first, I want to talk about chemical reactions in general. So chemical reactions is essentially taking things and adding them to each other and changing them around. So reactants are things that go into a chemical reaction. So for instance, when we talked about cellular respiration, we take some glucose, we take some oxygen. Those are reactants that go into the chemical reaction. The product, what is produced by it, is some ATP, some carbon dioxide, and some water. So reactants go into a chemical reaction and get changed into products. And what enzymes do is they speed up those chemical reactions. They make them take place more rapidly. And how they actually do this is that they lower what is known as activation energy. So most reactions require some energy input in order to get started, in order to activate that particular chemical reaction. So I think a really good example of this is a campfire. So say you're having a campfire or a bonfire or whatever fire. So fires are essentially chemical reactions. They're taking products. They're taking reactants and adding oxygen to them and breaking them down and kind of breaking them apart. And so that's a chemical reaction. But in order for that chemical reaction to get going, in order for you to get a campfire going, you need to put some energy in. You essentially need to heat up that wood in order for that wood to be able to combust, for it to be able to undergo that burning chemical reaction, right? So you need to, put some like newspaper or something underneath your campfire, underneath the pieces of wood, and light that newspaper on fire in order to heat up the wood enough that it will start combusting. So you need to put in that energy, that burning newspaper has to go in there in order to get that chemical reaction going. But once it's going, then you don't need any more activation energy. It just goes on its own. Once the campfire is going, you don't need to keep adding more and more newspaper to it because it'll keep going on its own. And so what enzymes actually do is they bind to the reactants and bring them to each other. They kind of help the reactants find each other, and that makes it easier for the chemical reactions to go, for them to take place. So there are certain molecules that are then kind of like anti-enzymes. And what they do is they stop a chemical reaction from taking place. And how they do that is by binding to an enzyme and preventing it from going anywhere. They kind of give the enzyme a hug, and that keeps that enzyme from going and doing what it would normally do, binding to reactants and making chemical reactions take place. And there are a lot of pharmaceutical products that actually work in this way. There's a lot of pharmaceutical products that are inhibitors. So for instance, I think you've probably all heard of penicillin. So it is a type of antibiotic that kills bacteria. And what it does is it inhibits the bacteria from producing their plasma membrane. Right? So we learned about cell plasma membranes. That's what protects the outside of a cell. And cells, have to produce it in order to grow and in order to make more cells. What penicillin does is it inhibits enzymes that bacteria need in order to make their plasma membrane. So if they can't make their plasma membrane, they can't make more bacteria, and the bacteria just die off without reproducing. That's how penicillin works, is by inhibiting an enzyme. It's the same with ibuprofen. So ibuprofen blocks pain signals, and how it does it is by inhibiting enzymes that allow parts of your nervous system to work, that allows your nervous system to transmit pain signals from receptors, say on your hand, to your brain, where those signals are where we are able to cognate those signals and make decisions based upon them. So ibuprofen kind of slows down those pain signals being sent by inhibiting enzymes. Okay, the last thing I wanted to, or the last kind of set of processes that I want to talk about in this chapter is membrane function and how things go in and out of cells. So we already kind of talked about this. Here we have our plasma cell membrane. It's made of the double phospholipid bilayer. And we have got our proteins that are embedded within that phospholipid bilayer that are regulating what's going in and out of the cell. So first, a little bit of a refresher, or maybe this is the first time you're hearing about these terms. So there's a couple things. There are these terms that you need to know to kind of get to understand what's going on at membranes. So there's solute and there's solvent. I believe I talked about these back in chapter 2 because I talked about these in the context of water. So water is a really good solvent. What solvents do is they dissolve other things. They dissolve solutes. So solute will dissolve into a solvent. So for instance, if you were to take a glass of water and you were to put some sugar into that water, the sugar would be the solute and it would dissolve into the solvent, which is the water. So one type of kind of movement along a membrane is what's known as passive transport, or otherwise known as diffusion. So this has to do with the fact that molecules will move around randomly according to what's known as Brownian motion. And with certain types of particles, you can actually see this under a microscope. And what Brownian motion describes is how molecules that are dissolved into a solution, they kind of bounce into each other. And they're trying to stay away from each other. They don't like touching, so they kind of bounce, and they're kind of like little like bumper cars, at a carnival. They kind of bounce into each other. So that's Brownian motion. And so as they're kind of bouncing around into each other, they kind of spread out. And so that kind of describes diffusion. So diffusion is how molecules go from where they're in a high concentration, where there's a large density of those molecules, to where there's a low density of those molecules. So let's return again to the example I gave a minute ago, where you have a glass of water and you put some sugar into that water. So at first, the sugar is going to all be at the very bottom of the water glass, right? It's going to all be concentrated down there at the bottom. So it's in a very high concentration. But you know that what will happen over time is that sugar is going to dissolve into the water glass. So those sugar molecules that are at the bottom of the glass, where there's a high concentration, they're going to diffuse out to the part of the glass that has a low concentration of sugar molecules, right? So they're going to diffuse from where there's a high concentration to where there's a low concentration. And this is just what they do on their own, just according to Brownian motion. So no energy is needed for this to take place. So say, for instance, we had a cell, and this is the cell membrane of that cell in yellow. And let's say we had some molecules of dye. Let's say that all the molecules were on the outside of the cell. So to the left of this is the outside of the cell, to the right is the inside of the cell. So all these molecules, they want to get away from each other, right? They want to get from where they're in a high concentration to where they're in a low concentration. As we can see on the inside of the cell, there's no molecules of dye, so they're going to try to get there. They're going to try to move to the inside of the cell. And that's what they're actually going to do. There's going to be some movement in and out of the cell, but for the most part, the diffusion is going to be going into the cell from where there's a high concentration to a low concentration. So eventually what we will reach is a state of equilibrium, where there is an equal concentration of molecules of dye on the inside of the cell as there are on the outside of the cell. Right? So we go from high concentration to low concentration until there's a state of equilibrium where there's an equal amount of concentration in all different areas. And you can think of this, even just if you were to take a glass of water and drop some food coloring into it. At the beginning, there would just be the food coloring at the very top and it would be very concentrated, but eventually it would spread out throughout the rest of the glass. Until there was an equal distribution of that food coloring throughout the entire glass of water. And the glass of water would be completely uniform in color. So that is diffusion. And like I was saying, diffusion requires no energy. It just happens on its own, which is why it's referred to as a passive transport, where you don't need any energy to make it work. Active transport is when you actually do need energy to make it go. So active transport is when we pump molecules from low concentration to high concentration. So remember, molecules typically want to go from high to low. So typically, if there's more of them here, they would want to, on their own, just naturally go to where there's a lower concentration of them, right? That would be simple diffusion. So in order to get those molecules to be concentrated on this side, we need some energy, which is why this is active transport. So what do you have going on here? This is a protein that is embedded within the phospholipid bilayer, right? So this is the whole thing is the plasma cell membrane. And this protein needs energy in the form of ATP to pump this solute from where it's in a low concentration to where it's in a high concentration. So energy is needed to make active transport happen. Because on their own, naturally, this solute would go from high to low. To get high to low concentration, that is. So to get it to go from low concentration to high, we need some energy to make that happen. So that's what active transport is. Okay, so what we're going to talk about now is the movement of something else. So with active transport and passive transport and diffusion, we were talking about solute being moved around. Osmosis refers to water being moved around. So it's literally the diffusion of water. And we're going to talk about it in the context of water going across a membrane. So from one side of a cell to another side of a cell. So let me draw a membrane for us. So let's say we've got our membrane, and it's got some holes in it because all membranes are porous, so things can move throughout them. And let's say, let's just say that this is the inside of a cell, and let's say that this is the outside of a cell. Okay, and now I'm going to draw in some solute. So let's say there's a lot of solute, so that's these little black dots. Let's say there's a lot of solute on the outside of the cell, and very little of it on the inside of the cell. So first let's talk about what's going to go on here in terms of diffusion. So in terms of diffusion, the solute, so these little black dots, right? They're going to want to go from when they're in a high concentration, which is on the outside of the cell, to where they're in a low concentration, which is on the inside of the cell. So the solute is going to move this direction. It's going to move from high concentration to low concentration. Osmosis, which is the movement of water, which we just described, or just talked about a second ago, that is going to go in the opposite direction. So water is always going to go from where there's a low concentration of solute to where there's a high concentration of solute. So the solute and the solvent are always going in opposite directions. And the movement of the solvent, the water, is osmosis. The movement of the solute is diffusion. And when we talk about the movement of water, we can kind of talk about three different solutions when we're kind of comparing, say the inside of a membrane to the other side of a membrane. If we say that a solution is hypertonic, hyper meaning a lot, so like a child that is hyperactive has a lot of activity. It's pretty, maybe if you gave that child some coffee, which would be a really bad idea, the kid is all hopped up and is now really, really active, so they'd be hyperactive. So that's when a solution has a high solute concentration. Hypotonic, think of like hypothermia. That's when you're too cold. That is a low solute concentration. So if you have a hypertonic solution and a hypotonic solution, solute is always going to move from hypertonic to hypotonic because solute diffuses from where there's high concentration to where there's lower concentration. Water is going to move by osmosis from hypotonic to hypertonic because water always goes from where there is a low concentration of solute to where there's a high concentration of solute. So just to reiterate, so solute is always going to go from high concentration to low, right? So that is the solute, and water is always going to go from where there's a low concentration of solute to where there's a high concentration of solute, right? So that's the direction that the water is going to go. And eventually, what is going to happen is you reach an equilibrium, where if you have two solutions and their solute is the same, we say that they are isotonic to each other. Iso meaning equal, so they have similar amounts of solute concentration in them. So let's talk about what would happen if you were to take one of our cells, say a red blood cell, and put it into isotonic versus hypotonic versus hypertonic solution. So if you put an animal cell, so if you take one of your red blood cells and you put it in an isotonic solution, the amount of water that is going in is going to equal the amount of water that is going out. And the amount of solute that is going in is going to equal the amount of solute that is going out. So that's great. That's what an animal cell needs. That's what our blood cells need, which is why our blood cells have pretty much the same solute concentration inside as the fluid around them does. But let's say that you took one of your blood cells and you put it in distilled water. So put it in water that had no solute in it. So now what would happen is inside the red blood cell would be hypertonic. Outside the blood cell would be hypotonic. So water always goes from where there's a low solute concentration to where there's a high solute concentration. So water is going to go in. And if too much water goes in, it's going to cause the cell to lyse, meaning that it bursts and all of the innards kind of pops and goes outside. And so this is what would literally happen if you took your blood cells and you put way too much water around them, straight tap water or distilled water. So that's why, our bodies regulate water, because you don't want your blood to be too fluid. You don't want it to be too watery, because your red blood cells could burst if there was too much water. Of course, you would have to drink an absolute crap ton of water for that to happen. But just saying, if you were to take a blood cell and put it in distilled water, it would burst. Similarly, if you were to take one of your red blood cells and you were to put it in, say, the Dead Sea or in Great Salt Lake, where there's a tremendous amount of salt, it's very, very hypertonic, what would happen is all the water inside of the red blood cell would escape. Because water tries to go from where there is a low concentration, that would be inside of the cell, to where there's a high concentration of solute, which would be outside of the cell. So water would escape, and the poor little red blood cell would shrivel up. So that would be really bad. So that's why in animals like us, there's water balance that goes on. So we osmoregulate, meaning that we balance how much water goes into us, how much water goes out, and we regulate how much solute goes in and how much solute goes out. And how we mainly do that is with our kidneys, right? So we have these two kidneys, and what they do is they control how much water stays within our bodies and how much solute stays within our bodies. Which is why you can kind of tell in a very crude way, just how much water and how much solute is inside of you, right? If your urine is really clear, essentially your kidney has decided, okay, you've got plenty of water, so I'm going to get rid of water and not get rid of too much solute. Whereas if your pee is this dark, which I have a hard time imagining how someone's pee would actually be that dark, but if it is, you should probably call 911. If your pee is that dark, essentially your kidney is saying you need water. Like you have not enough water, and so when you pee and it's this dark, what's going on is your body's holding on to as much water as it can. So that the urine is super, super concentrated with solute and very little water is actually leaving the body, because the body needs all the water it can get because it doesn't have enough. So that's what's going on when you see these different colors of your urine. In general, you want to be, in the top here, meaning that you have enough water for your cells. You definitely don't want to be down here. That's really, really bad. Okay, and so that's all I've got to tell you about different processes going on inside of our cells. So in the next chapter, we're going to delve into one of those in a little bit more detail. We're going to talk about cellular respiration in a bit more detail and about the actual processes that go into making that take place.